I call the honourable member David Cleandon.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Mr Cleandon.
Sir, I'm pleased to take, I think, my first call on this bill. This bill has lingered a while. The previous speaker's dates were quite correct, according to my records as well. And so I didn't sit on this committee. But it's a bill the Greens will be supporting because it does some good. But only some. I wouldn't go so far as to say it also does some harm, but there are provisions in this legislation which will be at least problematic, and particularly around victim impact statements, and I'll say some more about that later. But essentially it's a very incremental approach. It's a bitzer approach. It adds a little here, takes a little away there. It is not the comprehensive look at victims' rights and improving our justice system generally that is really what is wanted. And I'm afraid I can't share Mr Simpson's glowing opinion of our justice system. In international terms, yes, it is very robust. It has some excellent qualities, but it's far from ideal. There's a great deal more we could be doing, and indeed should be doing. I was pleased to hear Mr Little say that the Labour Party is committed to a comprehensive review of all of the issues around victims and indeed the dispensation of justice. I will hold Mr Little to that when we have a new government next year. I recall in 2005 the passing of the Prisoners and Victims Claims legislation, which the Greens supported with a sunset clause on the reassurance that it would lead to a comprehensive overview of victims' rights. And sadly that didn't occur and still hasn't occurred. So we look forward to the time when we'll be able to initiate that, to have a clean sheet look at how we can do better in terms of dealing with offenders and ensuring victims are given the best possible treatment. So this legislation talks a lot about victims' impact statements, giving people the right to say their piece in court, to express their views, their feelings, to address the offender directly and speak to them in terms of what the offending has meant to that person who is the victim of that offending. And on the face of it, that's a good thing, and for many people it'll be very cathartic. But it could also be quite a frustrating and also quite a limiting experience. If a person is there delivering their statement, looking at an offender who might be giggling or pulling faces or clearly not in the least bit moved or concerned about the statement, that will not be helpful for the well-being of the victim. So the impact statements, while at one level, at a superficial level, are a good thing, they're somewhat more complex perhaps than this bill would have us believe, or indeed than is reflected in the text and the provisions of the bill. I note that there was some concern from the judges about, or from some elements of the judiciary, about the original drafting of the bill. That almost seemed to indicate that the judge should listen carefully and respond to the victim's comments about sentencing. Of course, it is up to the judges, to the judiciary, to make sentencing decisions. And the judges were very nervous about the idea that somehow the victim might believe themselves to have an opportunity to influence the judge's sentencing. And on that note, I think some of the commentary we got at the time, or that was given to the committee by Kim Workman and Rethinking Crime and Punishment organisation, was quite helpful and quite insightful as ever. In that contribution, there's a reference to an assumption, what Mr Workman calls a flawed assumption, and that is that there's an imbalance between offenders' rights and victims' rights, and that in order to restore the balance between victims and offenders' rights, it is necessary to reduce offenders' rights. And that is a very muddled set of thinking, but that thinking is very prevalent, and we see it constantly, and dare I say it, we saw it today at the committee hearing commentary from some of the submitters. The correct move, of course, is to advance the rights of victims, to do all we can for them. It is not a trade-off. We don't have to be so-called tougher on crime or tougher on offenders in order to ensure that victims get a good outcome and a fair outcome. So there's a lot of information in this bill, a lot of reference in the bill to rights of victims to do such things as be informed about sentencing, about potential release on bail or on parole rather of an offender, If an offender absconds or indeed dies in prison, then or is about to be released, the victim has a right to know that according to this legislation, and that's a good thing. There's also reference to a code for victims, so that victims will be that we can be assured that victims are told their rights in legal processes. But somehow a lot of that feels like events have overtaken the legislation. Most of that is common practice now, and one wonders almost at the necessity for this legislation. Perhaps it simply codifies best practice or current practice. I'm not really sure on that. But it does seem to have been overtaken by events a little bit. I guess one of my concerns about this legislation is that to some extent it almost seeks to define the victim as a victim rather than as a person who's been offended against. And there is a difference in that. We don't want people to be trapped into this self-awareness or this perception that they are a victim and will remain so forever and ever. Yes, people are victimised by crime, but it's important that that doesn't define or doesn't become the defining characteristic of their self-identity. And I think some of the well-intentioned, perhaps, provisions in this bill actually take us down that road. I'm fortunate. I've never been the victim of a serious crime. Probably the nastiest thing happened to me. I had a motorcycle stolen that I'd invested quite a lot of time and money into, and I was seriously concerned about it for an afternoon. Capital punishment for motorcycle thieves just briefly seemed not a bad idea, but I got over that. I was not defined by that crime against me. And in all seriousness, even for people who do suffer, who are victims of very serious offences, ought not to have that as their defining characteristic of them as people. So I referred to Mr Workman's contribution, and I'm a great fan of Rethinking Crime and Punishment. They talk about restorative justice, and this is the heart of the Greens' approach to justice and justice processes, is to seek to restore both the offender and indeed the victim, because working with both together in a context of a community is likely to generate much better outcomes, much longer term outcomes, and restorative justice processes are proven everywhere in the world to reduce recidivism, often by as much as 20%, and I'm sure we all agree that that would be a positive move here. I think we need to move away as much as we can from the adversarial system, and the Minister introducing the bill did make the obvious comment and affirmed we have an adversarial system, and I think that's something in the longer term we need to think through. Is that the best way? But in terms of resolving these issues, to the extent that they are adversarial, there's always a winner and a loser. And I think we need to move away from that. That the heart of restorative justice is about the offender taking responsibility for their offending, feeling a degree of shame, contrition, and committing to do better in the future, to not re-offend. It's important that the person, the victim of the crime, feels that they have been somehow redeemed, that they have an acknowledgement, because again, the research tells us that people typically are not looking for compensation in a material sense. They just want somebody to take responsibility, to recognise they have been, that the people have been done some harm, and then they can move on and get on with their lives, hopefully in a context where they're unlikely to be re-victimised, either by another offender or indeed by the judicial system, because that is a very real danger, that the justice system can actually have the effect of re-victimising people if we are not very careful about how we do that. Finally, sir, again, I'd quote Mr Workman in his submission at the time, talking about the belief that decisions in relation to conviction and sentence should be determined more upon an objective view of offending than a subjective view of the victim. It is unwise to allow victims in the heat of the moment to make law. That's our task. It must be objective, it must be done with integrity, and I look forward to a time when we can have a comprehensive look at victims' rights and get it right. Kia ora.
I call the Honourable Member Paul Foster-Bell.
Paul Marie, Mr Speaker.